Welcome, everybody. This is going to be a discussion on what exactly the terms on the screen means. That are terms left hand and right hand paths. I see a lot of confusion around these terms. I see a lot of debate. So I'm going to kind of take the most neutral look into the subject as I can. So that statue is a depiction of a very common image in Tantric Buddhism, which is often thought about when discussing this topic. Tantric Buddhism and Hinduism specifically. That's because the terms right hand and left hand path comes from India, and it describes tantric practices that were either Dakshinachara, which is kind of the more traditional, often considered Vedic practices, and Vamachara or Vamamarga, which are the more taboo practices. The most infamous practices are what in English are called the 5 M's. The practice that is most associated with Vamachara is called Panchamakara, and they are called the 5 M's because each of the pillars of that practice starts with M, and those words are Madhya, Mamsa, Matsya, Mudra, and Maithuna. And so it's actually in both tantric schools, but how the people who practice left hand tantra would describe it is that it is things you must ritualistically indulge in, which would be alcohol, meat, fish, pound grain, and intercourse. Hence the statue, even though it's more of a Buddhist statue. The right hand path also uses like those foundations, but they have different interpretations for it. For example, they say that mudra would be the gesture, so that would be kind of the interpretation that people think of when somebody says mudra is kind of like the hand gestures one does when meditating or doing yoga. So just in the conversation between the differences of these traditions, we can see that traditionally the left-hand path would be more about recognizing Maya or illusion and breaking free of that through challenging society. The right-hand path would consider these words in isolation to determine what the esoteric meaning is, which is quite different from how the West conceptualizes these terms, to be honest. Not completely different, but it is a shame that a lot of people do not consider the Hindu origin of these these terms. So, I hope you enjoyed the clip art thing I did, but, so, in Western esotericism, the left-hand path challenges the status quo in order to achieve knowledge of all things. It is considered the path of radical self-improvement, the path where you're the one who sets the rules, the path of accepting two sides, or as Nietzsche would put it, the Dionysian philosophy of both good and evil. There's a lot of things that Western LHP practices do that are very similar to Hindu LHP practices. Mainly the kind of acceptance that society will see your personal path or philosophy as taboo. But in reality, what this path is saying is, this is for you personally to go beyond what society says you are and realize what truth is. That's, some people will say it in a different way, but that's what I interpret it. So this is just comparisons on the differences between the two. They're not mutually exclusive, but I kind of notice in researching Tantra especially that even Tantrics on the Dharmacharya path, they do the traditional Hindu path of seeking a guru, and most tantrics are they either on their Shakti with their consort Shiva, so they focus on the feminine regardless of whether or not they believe Shakti or Shiva is supreme reality, or they're Vaishnavites, which some people have interpreted as Vishnu being the feminine aspect of the masculine reality. And in the Western world, the Western world is a lot more anti-dogmatic in how they approach things, and there's also less of a defined pantheon, so people usually consider that like people who worship demons because, woo, scary, why are you worshiping demons? But I think that the reason people kind of consider demonology and the related paths as LHP is because just the very thought that you could put a well, depending on how you look at it, either an earthly or anti-celestial being in such a high position, and your theology is on its own heretical. Although there are other forms of spirituality, specifically in the mystic and tradcraft spheres, that are considered left-hand path. Not everybody who focuses on for example, Gnosticism or like traditional witchcraft would consider themselves LHP, but many out there openly state that, especially neo-Gnostics. I know the fairy tradition has openly embraced that label, and it's interesting to kind of like compare and contrast the origin of the LHP with what it has evolved to in the West. It kind of puts a lot of things in perspective, in my opinion. Now, are they useful? I think that's going to depend on who you ask. I mean, I personally think the labels are useful, but it's more practical to define your practice as what is not than what it is, and a lot of people who walk left-handed paths tend to find a label that specifically says I am anti-dogma to be more communicative than a label that is your theology, mostly because I find a lot of LHP practitioners either pull from multiple theologies or are part of a tradition that embraces all theologies as multiple languages of the same source, if you get what I'm trying to say. Kind of like the Hindu saying, all gods are God, or all devas are Brahma. To be more linguistically precise. Okay, so I think the term is really as useful as you make it out to be. It's quite strange that people who consider themselves LHP, they'll say that more, not necessarily openly, but that is more of an applicable label to them than people who consider themselves RHP. And of course there are people who are like, those terms mean nothing to me, those terms don't apply them to me, and honestly I find all of those interpretations to be fair. I'm not saying I agree with all of them, but if you feel that is fair to you, that is fair to you, and don't let anybody else force a label upon you. That is your label to claim, regardless of what you take away from this. To recap real quick. Terms are based on Hinduism. Hinduism focuses on societal norms. Labels confusing. As someone who applies labels, that is an interesting discussion that is still going on. You should do what feels right for you. You should always do what feels right for you, as long as it's reasonable and you don't put yourself in a predicament that cannot be rectified. So that was interesting, wasn't it? I normally do a book for review, so if you like that, consider subscribing. I usually post a new video every other Saturday. I've been trying to branch out a little bit with days I post and all that, but every 2 weeks on Saturday I will more likely than not either post a book review or something like this. So, yeah, I hope to see you around.